Well, that was kind of unexpected. Anyway, this is quite a long video, so definitely take advantage of the timestamps at the bottom. And if you haven't checked out the previous 2 videos I did, where I go over all the parts, why I chose this frame and stuff like that, definitely check that out, link down in the description. And if you're not prepared to listen to this annoying voice for the next 30 or so minutes, feel free to mute the audio, put on some of your favorite tunes and enjoy the build, I guess. I will head out for a ride in the cold, so I'll catch you in a bit. Alright, so let's get into this. My first objective was to build up the bike just enough to get it up on the trainer without committing to cutting any steerers or brake hoses. This was because I wanted to confirm the stem length and the stem height. On paper, I had already figured out that I needed a 110mm stem, but since the stem I want to get for this bike in the end is on the more expensive side, I really wanted to make sure that I didn't make any mistake here. So to get it onto the trainer, I needed the dry train in place, and since I'd rather not faff about with bottom brackets more than necessary, I wanted to get all the internal cables and brake hoses routed before the bottom bracket goes on. Now let's start with a little bit of a warning. If you ever get this kind of lever kit like I have here, you get hoses included, and most people will realize that the hoses included are of different lengths, so one for the rear and one for the front. So remember to use the longer one for the rear, and let's not pretend that I've used the long hose for the front in the past, just to realize that the hose I had for the rear was not long enough anymore. I would never make such a mistake in reality, of course, so let's move on. So here I'm going to prepare the caliper side of the hose by installing the insert or barb with the help of my new hydraulic hose tool from Shimano that both cuts the hose, and with the hose still in the tool, I just simply put the barb or insert in this little holder piston thing and press. It's brilliant. I don't know why I haven't gotten this tool before. It's not cheap, but if you plan on building more than one bike in your life, I would argue that it's worth it. It's not flawless though, as I will show you later in this video. Before I route the hose through the frame, I want to put on a foam sleeve over the hose to keep anything from rattling. This foam sleeve is a leftover from my open build, but you should be able to find something similar in your local hardware store, I would think. I gotta say, I'm a little bit disappointed that they didn't include this with the frame set. After I put the sleeve on the hose, I just made sure it would be in the right place, starting just behind the bottom bracket, all the way up to the head tube. Since the opening on the chainstay is pretty big without the rubber grommet in place, I could route the hose with the foam sleeve in place from that side. That way I could simply push the hose all the way up to the head tube without using any kind of routing tools. So very simple and easy. After that, the first thing I had to do was to get that rubber grommet in place, as I know this is stuff I easily forget. I don't want to realize I forgot this after the caliper is in place, which was the next step. Of course, I could have done this before I routed the hose, but I didn't, so no complaining. The hose nut goes on first, then the olive, a little dab of grease on the olive before I screw this in while keeping the hose firmly pushed into the caliper. It actually helped having the hose installed in the frame, I found out. The standard size bolts that comes with the caliper was the correct size for my chainstays here, as you can see with the bolt checking tool that's included with the caliper. Depending on chainstay thickness, you might have to shim with washers or order different length bolts. I think Shimano has a chart over chainstay sizes and bolt lengths that you can refer to as well. With the brake in place, it's time to get to the Di2 wiring as well. Starting from the rear mech, I used a 650mm wire and put on a couple of plastic Di2 wire clips to minimize any rattling. You can use normal zip ties as well, but it could be hard to get those through the frame holes depending on your frame. Either way, the Di2 clips are really cheap and I had a bunch of them left over from previous builds. Starting from the back, I could simply push the cable through the chainstay, to the BB shell without any routing tools. Smooth sailing, and finishing it off with installing that rubber grommet that I usually forget, and that came with the frame set. With the 700mm Di2 cable for the battery through the seat tube, I could finally use the Park Tool routing tool that I picked up for this build. Simply matter of dropping the magnet side down the tube. No need to use the magnet itself since gravity does the job just fine. Connect the Di2 cable to the other end of the routing tool and just pull it through. Nice and easy. This for my homemade routing tools I've used in earlier builds does the job just as well. It's when you have to use the magnet the Park Tool really shines, but yeah, they will come a bit later in the build. The Di2 battery holder is supplied with the frame set and simply clamps around the upper side of the battery and then slides down in the seat tube. It sides perfectly to make sure you can slide that seat topper over. Neat and lightweight solution, even though I'm not a super big fan of the proprietary Seatpost solution as a whole. At least this was well thought out. The last Di2 cable through the frame is a 120cm long wire through the down tube, using the same method as with the battery cable, pulling it from the head tube down to the bottom bracket. Here I will connect all the wires with the junction A, and since I'm not using a front derailleur, I'm plugging the empty connection with the Di2 plug that you usually get with the shift levers. Now, since rattling is the worst thing I know, I will try to minimize this by first wrapping the junction in a strip of handlebar tape. I will also zip tie the cables in a loop around the junction itself. This is just an extra insurance that no cables will somehow pull out from the junction box. Let's say if the rear mech Di2 cable gets caught in anything. I also leave the excess zip tie as it will help with any rattling issues. Then it's just a matter of fitting the junction up in the down tube of the frame and make sure any wires don't interfere with the bottom bracket or crank spindle. With that in place, a quick clean on the bottom bracket threads. It might look clean, but there's always some dirt still in there. Good riddance. Before I install the BB and the crank though, I just want to put the headset and fork in place and test out the routing, the brake hose and the Di2 cable to make sure the lengths are what they should be. So I will flip over the frame on the stand so I can anchor it in the fork instead of the chainstay. As you can see, the rear brake hose and eventually the front hose together with the Di2 cable will be routed inside the upper headset bearing. The fork steerer tube is not round to accommodate space for the hoses and cables, and the special split ring has cutouts for the cables and hoses as well, while keeping the fork steerer perfectly centered in the upper headset bearing. Lastly, the headset cover and the routing spacers goes on top of that. There are obviously disadvantages with this design, but I'm willing to take those to get this type of integration. I will go a bit more into those cons later in the build. So here's the tip. If you have an indoor smart trainer, that's the absolute best and most stable work stand when it comes to working on bottom brackets and cranks. However, my Kickr core is not compatible with the Trek Emonda frame. As you can see here, the non-drive side Kickr end cap doesn't fit correctly into the frame. This is luckily fixable with the help of a grinder, and even my simple budget Dremel did the job. It's definitely not pretty, but as long as it works without breaking the frame, I'm happy. Obviously, the end cap will not work for 148 spacing anymore, but I don't have any bikes with that spacing, so I don't care. With the bike securely in the strainer, time to get that Chris King T47 bottom bracket in place. A bit of grease on the threads and the cups goes in pretty smoothly. Nice to be back in the threaded world, mostly for the ease of removal, if I'm totally honest. The BB shell width of the Trek means the bearings will sit inside of the bottom bracket shell as opposed to externally. This also means the splines are super shallow, and as you can see, even with a proper T47 tool, I slipped once and it did leave some marks on the outside of the shell as I torqued it down to the 50 Nm specification. Another thing worth mentioning is that the center sleeve is not wide enough for the 85.5 or 86.5 shell. I've contacted Chris King about this and they don't make a sleeve for this shell width and instead suggest not using the center sleeve at all. So I need to be extra careful making sure that the hoses and cables clear the crank spindle. With both cups in the frame, it's time to install the crank, and I've done a full installation video of the THM Clavicula SCB4, so I want to go over that in as much detail here. But one thing worth mentioning is that Trek for some reason decided to go with a non-standard 85.5mm shell width as opposed to the standard 86.5. This means I need 1.5mm shim on each side. Chris King sells these fit kits to make their bottom brackets work with all kinds of different frames and cranks, and the fit kit used for the Trek together with a 30mm spindle is the fit kit number 5 that includes those shims. Now, with Chris King having angular contact bearings and more robust fully contacting seals, don't expect any mind-blowing spin test out of the box like you might have seen in my other video with the ultra low friction seal NTM bearings, but everything felt very smooth and will only get better as I get some distance in. The pedals are none other than the Dura Ace 9100 pedals, nothing more to say about that. So now I'm almost ready to get the bike on the trainer to make sure my stem calculations are okay. I only need to put the seat topper and the saddle roughly where I want it. Carbon paste is my friend here, and I never needed to torque a seat post on any of my bikes more than 4 Nm, even though the max torque is usually a lot higher than that. On a side note, this fixed torque 4 Nm from Park Tool is my new favorite tool. 4 Nm is what I use the most by far, and not having to think about checking any settings is such a luxury. But it's definitely just that, it's a luxury tool, it's not necessary, but oh, I love having this. Rear derailleur on, 8 to 10 Nm, and pop that Di2 cable in. Lastly, mounting the levers on the bars. Again, this will only be to confirm the stem length and height position, since I really need to be sure. The length of the brake hoses also depends on the stem length, so that's why I was so determined to try out this on the trainer before starting cutting any hoses to length. So I tested both my 110 Uno stem as well as my 120mm Extralite stem, and my calculations seems to be correct. I will be going down to a 110mm stem from a 120 that I used on the Open. The new stem is now ordered and it has the same 40mm stack height as my Uno stem, which is also 110mm long. So that is what I will be using until the new stem arrives. This also means I can use the Uno stem to measure and cut the steerer. I did, however, leave more steerer than I really needed. I always feel nervous cutting steerers, so having a bit of extra is good for my nerves. I also needed to count that little extra lip on the expander that sits on top of the steerer, but that will be more important once I do the final cut in the future when the proper stems arrives. For now, I have about 12mm of spacers above the stem, but eventually I would like to take that down to 5mm. The actual cutting is super simple on the other hand, as long as I have my saw guide. A bit of water spray keeps the carbon dust from flying everywhere, but I still recommend doing it outside and at least have some kind of mask or air filter just to be on the safe side. After the cut, I filed down any rough edges with the file and some fine grit sandpaper. The cut resulted in a reduction of 26.7 grams, which means the weight now for the cut fork is 379 grams. For anyone who's counting, I'm sure as hell not. With the steer cut, it's time to sort out the front brake and another chance to use the Shimano hose tool. But at this moment in the build, I had also used the tool to install my GRX levers on the Open, which meant I had cut old hoses with mineral oil in them, and just a little spill of that oil and the tool suddenly didn't grab the hose as good, and basically just slid back as I tried to push the barb into the hose. As you can see here, the barb insert just didn't go all the way in. First I did try to clean the tool with some alcohol, but without much success, and then kind of hit me carbon paste, and it actually worked. So a little quick hack there, although making sure the tool is clean and dry and free from any oils and stuff like that is preferable, of course. If there's a will, there's a way. With the barb in place, the hose can go into the caliper just like with the rear. Hose nut first, the olive with a dab of grease, and then torque it down. Then just push the hose up through the fork, and it will come up through the hole in the stereo tube. I attached the caliper to the fork blade and put the fork back on the work stand. A little zip tie to keep that hose in place along the stereo tube. I stole this idea from Mats Petersen Emonda Dream Build video, good stuff. A little bit of grease, install the lower headset bearing on the fork crown, grease the bearing seat in the frame as well, and made sure all the hoses and cables goes where they're supposed to. Before the upper bearing goes in, I will just screw in that little turn stopper in place. I wonder how long it will take for this thing to break. Time will tell, I guess. A little side note here, this will pretty much make it impossible to bag this bike for train travel with my current Rinko bag, unless I loosen the stem and turn the bars that way. Not a huge issue for me as I don't use the trains often nowadays, but good to know maybe. So as I install the upper bearings, it's pretty clear what the negatives of this design is. Doing any kind of headset cleaning will be tricky to say the least. Not impossible, but definitely more of a challenge since I need to cut or at least unscrew the brake hoses from the levers to completely remove the bearing. I knew this going in, so I'm prepared, but I will definitely keep a close eye on the headset and try to clear any grit and grime more often than normal. For me, it's a price I'm willing to pay for the integration and to get those cables out of the way. We'll see if I'll eat my words in the future. Now, while I won't use the integrated handlebars from Bontrager, I still want to make this as clean as possible, so a bit of shrink tubing will keep those hoses and cables nice and neat under the stem. This needs to go on now while in front of my face, otherwise I will forget about it as usual. Next, I need to route some Di2 cables through the handlebars. Luckily, THM has these bars pre-drilled just behind the levers, which is one reason I chose these bars apart from the familiar bend. Apologies here though, as I totally forget to check the camera while working and the focus is all kinds of whack. But as you can see, using the Park Tool routing tool make this dead simple, and this is also the only place I actually had to use the magnet, but boy is it handy. I can't for the life of me remember exactly what cable length I used, but from the right lever I had a long cable. I want to say it was 800 millimeters. That's going all the way to the left drop where the junction will be mounted. Then from the junction up to the left lever I used a 350 millimeter cable, I'm pretty sure. This way I will have one free port on that lever for an eventual satellite shifter, like a climber shifter or something that I probably never get, but it's always good to have options. Since the hoses don't need any slack outside of the frame when turning the bars, I really wanted to get the hoses as clean as possible despite these bars not being internally routed, so I was quite thorough in this step. I started by fixing the hoses temporarily to the bars with zip ties, as clean as tight as possible. This is just to make sure I cut the hoses to the perfect length. I even used a scrap bit of brake hose to see how deep into the lever the hose would go, then use that measurement on the real holes to get as close to the perfect length as I could. Then cutting using that brilliant Shimano hose tool. I love this thing. And just a quick test to make sure I didn't mess up the length. Seems good, so it's time to put the barb in. I'm so thankful to have this tool for this task. Now you can do it on the spot with the hose routed through the frame and everything. Brilliant. And just like with the caliper, the hose nut goes on first, the olive, a dab of grease, and screw the hose into the lever, making sure to keep a bit of pressure as I tighten that hose nut. With the hose in place, I can connect the Di2 cable coming from the frame junction to my right shifter and then secure both cable and brake hose together along the groove in the handlebar. With some electrical tape, a little extra loop of Di2 cable is always a good idea to keep it from being pulled out unintentionally. Not that it's a huge risk here with this level of integration, but it's better to be on the safe side. I did the same thing for the front brake hose, but no reason to show the same thing again. Instead, let's get some fluid into these brakes. Feels like I've done so many videos bleeding Shimano brakes, so we'll try to keep this quick and simple. I installed the bleed funnel on top, and for a fresh install I use a syringe to press up the Shimano mineral oil from the caliper end into the funnel. Remove the syringe and attach a plastic bag, or like here, a PET bottle to collect any brake fluid. Then it's just a matter of pumping the brake until no more air bubbles comes out. Tilting the frame back and forth helps with this. Once the lever has started to firm up, I squeeze the lever at the same time as I open the bleed nut on the caliper, and as the brake lever bottoms out, I quickly close the nut again and start pumping that lever to build pressure up again. I repeat this about 3 or 4 times until I'm happy with how the lever feels and there's no more air bubbles coming out anywhere. And that's pretty much it. The rear can take a bit more effort to get all that air out since the hose is a bit longer. But once that's done, remove the funnel and back with the bleed screw carefully. It's really easy to strip that 2mm hex groove. Quick cleanup with some degreaser and the brakes are done. As a man without hair, I put my hairdryer to good use on the shrink tubing. I also put a small piece around the Di2 and brake cable going to the right lever, but in hindsight, I should have either made this longer or skipped it altogether. All in all, I think it looks pretty neat, and I think it would look even better once I get the final stem that I should have in a week or two. To finish the front up, all that's left is the handlebar tape. But see if you can catch my mistake I do during this wrap. The only thing that's a bit different here is that we have that Di2 handlebar junction at the end. So the start of the wrap is a bit different than normal. I installed the junction first with the plug holder thingy that comes with the junction. Then I put a layer of double-sided tape, both to keep the junction more securely and also to make sure that the handlebar tape stays in place since it can't be stuffed into the handlebar like normal. I start the wrap with cutting the tape diagonally to get that nice and even start, and after that it's just a normal wrap the rest of the way. I don't do the figure 8 around the shift lever with this particular tape from Pro, as I find it can be a bit short. I really like to wrap my bars all the way on the tops, very close to the stem. So instead I use that extra piece to hide any gaps. Taping that piece in place temporarily with some electrical tape helps a lot when you only have 2 hands to work with. I continue up over the lever and I finish it off with a diagonal cut at the end to get a nice finish. And I prefer using this narrower electrical tape to secure everything rather than using the finishing tape you get with the handlebar tape. But that's just a personal preference. So, did you catch my mistake? Or I guess mistake might be the wrong word, I don't know. But I usually want to finish the wrap with the tape on the other side of the bar when pointing forward, if that makes sense. But as you saw there, the tape was actually on top of the bars in the forward direction. I realized I messed this up after doing the other side off camera. So I had to go back, unravel, rewrap again without doing the half figure 8 around the lever that I did without thinking about it the first time. I was worried that I didn't have enough tape left as I had to redo the diagonal cut at the end, but I just managed to get it where I wanted. Hopefully I won't do the same mistake in the future. By the way, if anyone wonders why I use a pretty heavy thick tape, For the record, it ended up being 77 grams. I always prefer riding without gloves, so a thicker tape will still give me the comfort I want, and I really have come to like this Pro Sports Control tape. I'm thinking of trying some other tapes on the open soon, so that might be some changes in the future here as well. So we're nearing the end. The bottle cages. I mounted the new tune bottle cages with some old carbon TI bolts I had left over from an old bike. I really like the look of these, but I definitely think Trek put the seat tube bottle cage hose a bit too far up the seat tube. It would have looked so much better with the bottles a bit further down in my opinion, but at least it will be easy to reach, I guess. They seem to hold the bottles pretty decent without that extra grip thing you get with the cages. No problem for the road, but nothing I would take off-road, I think. If you have a lot of old style camelback bottles though, you might have some troubles with the fit to these cages. The newer model though seems to work fine, same as with the popular purist bottles, no problems at all. Now, since I'm using my old Extralite wheels, there's nothing really to show there. The only part that's left now is the chain. And as I'm running a 1x to size the chain, I'm using the big cog plus 4 pins method. If anyone calls it that, I have no idea. But without going through the derailleur, I wrap the chain around the largest cog in the back, and where the chain meets, I count 4 pins, and that's where I break the chain. Now you probably noticed, as I did once I cut the chain, that I ended up with 1 outer link and 1 inner link, which is fine if you're using a joining pin. I am using a quick link though, so I needed to take off that last outer link and replace that with the quick link. Just a little brain fart that happens from time to time, more than I like to admit. With that sorted, on with the chain the proper way through the rear derailleur, and after using the lightweight PYC chain for the last year, I'm going back to a Shimano Dura or XTR 11-speed chain just to see if I notice any difference. Remembering that the Shimano chain is directional, but I couldn't for the life of me get that quick link to step in place with my chain link pliers. I'm pretty sure this is because I had cleaned my chain from any lubricant and it was bone dry, so I had to resort to putting the bike down on the floor and stomping the pedal to snap that in place. Not on video though, apologies for that. Then I could index the gears, starting with the B screw to make sure that the rear mech cleared that big 40T cog, and I'm pretty sure it would clear 42 as well. But 40 is the biggest I'll go on this bike. A little bit of tweaking on the low and high limit screws, and the indexing was pretty good out of the box. The last adjustments will be done out on the road once I put some lube on that chain. One last little tweak, the minuscule chainstay protection that came from the factory didn't really impress me, so I used the more robust one I had lying around. Not the prettiest thing, I might try to find a clear one of the same thickness, but I feel more safe with this on, at least in the beginning of the bike's life. And speaking of chain lube, I found a guy selling the new ceramic speed UFO drip here in Japan, so I decided to try that out and see what the fuss was all about. Applying it as per ceramic speed's instruction and letting it dry for a day. Well, just as with most wax solution, this is the result. I'm sure it's frictionless and blah blah blah, but I won't be using this much more than the first few rides. I need to be able to ride my bikes inside without messing up the whole room. So it's back to smooth for me in the future. With that, while not the final parts like the stem is there, the bike is ready for weighing. Well, that was kind of unexpected. Wow, 6.345 kilos. I was a bit surprised, like I mentioned back there. I definitely knew I would go below that 6.6 that I had set as a goal, but going below 6.4, that was a bit of a surprise. And that is with the Pedalupina, the Garmin mount, even though it doesn't weigh much, pedals and ball cages, as you always should do when you weigh your bike. God damn it. Now the reason I put on the Pedalupina is not because of any comfort issues, it's just because that bare carbon saddle is very slippery. And as usual, I always weigh the bike with the parts I actually use. I'm also waiting for that final stem, and that will probably lower the weight a bit, even though that will have a proper out front mount, so I can get rid of that thing. I think it also will make the whole front end even cleaner than it is, but I'm so stoked about that clean front end. There's also a couple of small things on the way in, and I think I will hit that sub 6.3 without much trouble. I will definitely do a follow-up video once all those parts come in. Now when it comes to ride impressions, what can I say? I spent too much money and built it up with my own hands and my own tools, I guess. So I can't really give a objective opinion. But I can say this, the handlebars is the biggest difference I can feel. Because my open handlebars, there are 48 in the drops, and these are 42. And descending in the drops is where I definitely got the first big, whoa, this is a different bike. But it still descends super confident, and I want to say it's a bit more responsive. God damn, I hate when people's bit more responsive. Yeah. Anyway, I must do a lot more riding before I can do any kind of final evaluation of this bike. But it feels so nice to ride and so light. I know people say weight doesn't matter, but have you climbed a really, really light bike before? Whew. So nice. In terms of negatives, I think I mentioned most of them in the build already. That C-tube ball cage, I think it could be a bit lower. You think I'm nitpicking much? The proprietary seat post solution, not my favorite in the world. Anyway, this video has been long enough now. I need to head home because it's getting pretty cold up here. And I will definitely do some follow-up videos once I get those new parts. So if you want to see that, I will catch you in the next one. Peace!